Most people take time to figure others out. They rely on repeated interactions, long conversations, and clear evidence before they decide how they feel about someone. But not everyone operates at that pace. Some people process social information much faster, not because they're guessing, but because they're paying attention to details most people overlook. From the very beginning of an interaction, they're not just listening to what's being said. They're watching how it's being said, the tone, the timing, the level of attention, the consistency between words and behavior. These small signals start forming a pattern almost immediately, and that pattern gives them an early sense of whether something feels aligned or off. Now here's where the difference shows. Most people ignore those early signals. They give the benefit of the doubt, they wait for more evidence, they assume things will become clearer over time. But someone who is highly observant doesn't always need that much time. When the same type of signal appears more than once, even in small ways, it's enough to create a preliminary conclusion. This doesn't mean they're judging harshly or unfairly. It means they're filtering. They're deciding where to invest their time and attention based on what they're already seeing. Because from their perspective, early patterns tend to repeat. And if something feels inconsistent at the beginning, it usually doesn't become more consistent later without a clear reason. So instead of continuing to engage and hoping for change, they adjust early. Not dramatically, not in a way that creates conflict, but subtly. They reduce how much they share. They limit how much they engage. They observe a little more and participate a little less. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. That early distance can be interpreted as disinterest, coldness, or lack of effort. But in reality, it's a form of decision-making. It's based on what's already been observed, not on what hasn't happened yet. Another important part of this is speed. The faster someone processes social signals, the faster they reach conclusions about alignment. And when alignment doesn't feel right, there's no reason, at least from their perspective, to continue investing at the same level. Now, this doesn't mean they're always correct. Early filtering is based on available information, and sometimes that information is incomplete. But the behavior that follows is consistent. Once a pattern is noticed, they don't ignore it. They act on it, even if that action is simply creating distance. And that distance is usually quiet. No explanation, no confrontation, no clear signal that something has changed. Just a shift in engagement. Less availability, less openness, less effort. And if the other person isn't paying attention, they might not even notice it happening. Over time, this pattern of quick filtering leads to fewer connections overall. Not because they're unable to connect, but because they're selective about where they invest. They're not trying to build a large network. They're trying to avoid misalignment. Because from their perspective, it's better to step back early than to stay long enough to confirm what was already visible in the beginning. Most people are comfortable operating at a surface level, especially in the early stages of interaction. Quick conversations, light topics, easy exchanges, these are the default. It keeps things simple, low risk, and easy to maintain across many people. And for a lot of situations, that works. It allows connections to form without much pressure, but not everyone experiences those interactions the same way. For someone who processes things more deeply, surface-level engagement doesn't feel neutral. It feels incomplete. There's a sense that something important is missing. The conversation might be smooth, even enjoyable on the surface, but it doesn't create a lasting sense of connection. And this is where the difference starts to show. Instead of trying to expand the number of interactions, the focus shifts toward increasing the depth of them. Fewer people, but more meaningful exchanges. Fewer conversations, but ones that actually go somewhere. Because depth, for them, isn't optional. It's what makes the interaction feel real. Now here's the challenge. Depth requires alignment from both sides. It requires openness, attention, and a willingness to go beyond basic interaction. And not everyone is operating at that level, especially in environments where speed and convenience are prioritized. So what happens is a mismatch. One person is comfortable staying on the surface, while the other is looking for something more substantial. And when that mismatch repeats across different interactions, it becomes noticeable. The conversations feel predictable. The engagement feels limited. There's nothing necessarily wrong, but there's nothing that stands out as meaningful either. Over time, that leads to a reduction in interest, not in people as a whole, but in those specific types of interactions. Because if the outcome is consistently the same, brief, surface level, and quickly forgotten, there's less motivation to keep repeating it. So instead of trying to maintain a large number of these connections, they start to narrow their focus. They invest in the few interactions that naturally go deeper, the ones where conversation doesn't feel forced, where there's genuine exchange, where both sides are engaged beyond just filling time. And because those types of connections are less common, the overall number of relationships becomes smaller, not by intention, but by preference. It's not about avoiding people. It's about avoiding repetition of interactions that don't lead anywhere meaningful. Another important factor is energy. Surface-level interaction might seem easy, but when it's repeated frequently without depth, it can start to feel draining. It requires attention without providing much return. It keeps things moving, but doesn't create anything lasting. So instead of spreading that energy across many shallow interactions, it gets concentrated into a few deeper ones. And that concentration changes the entire experience. Those connections feel more stable, more engaging, more worth maintaining. Now from the outside, this can look like isolation or lack of social effort. But that interpretation misses the underlying pattern. It's not about having fewer connections. It's about having more meaningful ones. The number decreases because the standard for connection increases. And once that standard is in place, it becomes difficult to go back to a lower level of interaction just for the sake of having more people around. Because quantity without depth doesn't feel like connection. It feels like noise. So while others are expanding their network, they're refining it. And that refinement naturally leads to fewer but stronger connections. At the beginning of most interactions, there's a natural tendency to stay open. People give space, they observe, they allow things to develop without immediately reacting to every small issue. And for someone who pays close attention to behavior, that openness comes with a level of patience. They're not looking for perfection, they're looking for patterns, because one moment doesn't define someone. A single inconsistency can be explained. A small mistake can be ignored. Even a few misaligned actions can be understood in context. So instead of reacting immediately, they wait. They watch how things repeat over time. And this is where the difference begins. Most people either react too quickly or ignore things for too long. But someone who is more observant takes a middle path. They don't confront every issue, but they don't forget it either. They let it sit and they see if it happens again. If it doesn't repeat, it fades. But if it does, if the same type of behavior shows up again and again, it stops being a one-time event. It becomes a pattern. And once something becomes a pattern, it carries more weight. Now here's the important part. The reaction to that pattern is rarely immediate or dramatic. There's no sudden confrontation, no emotional outburst, no clear signal that something has shifted. Instead, the change happens internally. First, expectations begin to adjust. The level of trust starts to recalibrate. The amount of energy being invested slowly decreases. And all of this happens without being announced. From the outside, everything may still look the same. Conversations continue, interaction remains, nothing appears to be wrong. But underneath that surface, the engagement is changing. It's becoming more limited, more controlled, more selective. Because once a pattern is recognized, there's no need to keep testing it. The information has already been gathered. The behavior has already been observed enough times to form a conclusion. And that conclusion doesn't need to be explained, it doesn't need to be argued, it simply needs to be acted on. And the way it's acted on is through distance. Not obvious distance. Not the kind that creates conflict or demands attention. Just a gradual reduction in involvement. Less availability, less emotional investment, less effort to maintain the same level of connection. And this is where most people get confused, because they're looking for a moment, something specific they can point to and say, that's when it changed. but there is no single moment. The change happened across multiple moments, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but significant when combined. By the time the distance becomes noticeable, the decision has already been made internally, not in a sudden way, but through accumulation. Repeated patterns, observed over time, leading to a clear understanding of what to expect. And once that understanding is in place, there's no need to stay at the same level of connection, because the purpose of staying open was to see if the pattern would change. And if it doesn't, the response becomes just as consistent as the behavior that caused it. So while others might expect confrontation or explanation, what actually happens is much quieter. A shift in presence, a change in engagement, a gradual move away from what no longer feels aligned. And by the time that shift is fully visible, it's not a reaction anymore. It's a decision that's already been made. At first, it doesn't look like protection. It looks like preference. Choosing certain environments over others, limiting time in specific conversations, stepping back from situations that feel unnecessary. On the surface, it can seem like simple selectivity, but underneath that, there's a clear structure guiding those choices. Because when someone becomes highly aware of how different environments affect them, they stop treating every interaction as neutral. They start recognizing that some conversations leave them steady, while others leave them drained. Some environments feel clear and focused, while others feel scattered and unpredictable. And once that difference is noticed consistently, it becomes difficult to ignore. So instead of moving through every situation the same way, they begin to adjust, not in a reactive way, but in a deliberate one. They start choosing where to place their attention, how long to stay engaged, and when to step back. It's not about avoiding people. It's about managing exposure. Now here's the part most people don't consider. Exposure isn't just physical. It's mental and emotional. Every interaction carries tone, expectation, and energy. And when those elements are inconsistent or excessive, they require processing. Over time, that processing adds up. If someone is constantly in environments where they have to interpret mixed signals, manage unpredictable reactions, or carry the emotional weight of others, it creates a kind of internal load, not immediately noticeable, but cumulative. And once that load reaches a certain level, it starts affecting clarity, focus, and overall stability. So instead of waiting for that point, they adjust early. They reduce the amount of time spent in situations that require too much processing. They limit interactions that feel one-sided or inconsistent. They create space between themselves and environments that don't allow them to stay grounded. And this adjustment often looks like distance from the outside. Less participation, fewer interactions, more time spent alone or in controlled settings. But that interpretation misses the purpose behind it. It's not about withdrawal, it's about regulation. Because when someone learns how different environments impact them, they also learn that not all exposure is worth it. Just because something is available doesn't mean it's beneficial. Just because an interaction is possible doesn't mean it needs to happen. Another important factor is predictability. Environments that are stable and consistent require less energy to navigate. You know what to expect, you know how to respond, and there's less need for constant adjustment. But environments that are inconsistent, where behavior changes frequently, where expectations are unclear, require more attention and more effort to manage. So naturally, there's a shift toward what is stable and away from what is unpredictable. Not because unpredictability is always negative, but because repeated unpredictability without clear structure becomes tiring to process. Over time, these choices create a more controlled environment. Fewer variables, fewer disruptions, fewer situations that require constant interpretation. And within that environment, clarity increases, focus improves. Energy becomes more consistent. Now, from the outside, this can be misunderstood as isolation or avoidance. But in reality, it's a system, a way of maintaining balance by controlling input rather than constantly reacting to it. Because once you understand how easily your internal state can be influenced by external factors, you stop leaving that influence unmanaged. You start making decisions based on what keeps you stable, not just what keeps you busy. And that's why the level of interaction decreases. Not because connection isn't important, but because not every interaction supports it. Most people assume that understanding and expression happen at the same level. If someone understands something deeply, they expect it to be explained clearly. If someone feels something strongly, they expect it to be shown openly. But that alignment isn't always there. In fact, for some people, the depth of what they process internally is much greater than what they choose to express externally. And that difference creates a gap. Not a flaw, but a gap between what is experienced and what is communicated. On the inside, there's detailed observation, layered interpretation, and careful analysis of behavior, tone, and patterns. On the outside, there may be fewer words, shorter responses, or a more reserved presence. Now here's where the misunderstanding begins. Most people rely on what they can see and hear directly. If something isn't expressed clearly, they assume it isn't there. If someone doesn't explain themselves in detail, they assume there isn't much to explain. But that assumption is based on visibility, not reality, because internal processing doesn't always translate into external communication. Some people think before they speak, filter before they share, and choose their words carefully, not because they lack clarity, but because they're selective about what they reveal. And this selectivity can be misread. Silence can be interpreted as disinterest. Short responses can be seen as lack of engagement. A calm or neutral expression can be mistaken for lack of emotion. But in many cases, what's happening internally is far more complex than what's being shown. This creates a pattern where others fill in the gaps themselves. When they don't receive clear signals, they make assumptions. They project their own expectations onto the situation. And those assumptions often don't match what's actually happening. For example, someone might assume distance when there is simply restraint. They might assume indifference when there is careful observation. They might assume confusion when there is internal clarity that just hasn't been expressed. And over time, these mismatches affect how the interaction develops. If someone is consistently misunderstood, they may reduce how much they try to explain, not out of frustration, but out of efficiency. If the effort to communicate doesn't lead to accurate understanding, it becomes less effective to keep increasing that effort. So instead of expanding expression, they refine it further. They become even more selective, sharing only when it feels necessary or useful. And that selectivity increases the gap from the outside perspective. Now here's the important part. This isn't about being unable to communicate. It's about choosing not to communicate everything. It's a controlled approach, not a limitation. But because it doesn't match the more common pattern of open and frequent expression, it often gets misinterpreted. And that misinterpretation creates distance. Not because connection isn't possible, but because understanding isn't always immediate. It requires attention, patience, and a willingness to look beyond what's obvious. So instead of relying only on what is being said, it becomes important to observe consistency over time, to notice how someone responds across different situations, not just how they explain themselves in a single moment. Because when expression is selective, behavior becomes the more reliable source of information. And when you focus on that, the gap between what is seen and what is actually there starts to become clearer. But if that gap is ignored or misunderstood repeatedly, it naturally leads to fewer connections. Not because the depth isn't there, but because it isn't easily recognized. At the beginning, solitude doesn't always feel comfortable. There's an expectation, spoken or unspoken, that being around people should be the default. That connection should be frequent, visible, and constant. So when interactions don't feel aligned, the initial response is often to adjust, to try again, to find a way to make it work. But over time, repeated experiences start to shape a different understanding. When interactions feel inconsistent, when conversations lack depth, when effort isn't matched, the contrast becomes clearer. It's no longer just about preference. It becomes about how different environments affect your clarity and stability. And this is where the shift begins. Instead of viewing solitude as something missing, it starts to feel like something controlled. a space where there's no need to interpret mixed signals, no need to adjust constantly to unpredictable behavior, no need to filter every response based on how it will be received. Because when you're alone, the environment is stable. The variables are limited. There's no external pressure to perform, respond, or adapt. And that stability allows something important to happen. Your attention returns to itself. Your thoughts become clearer, your responses more intentional, your energy more consistent. Now here's the part most people misunderstand. Choosing solitude isn't the same as avoiding connection. It's choosing the conditions under which connection feels meaningful. When the alternative is repeated exposure to interactions that feel misaligned or draining, solitude becomes the more effective option. And the more this pattern repeats, the more comfortable it becomes. Not because isolation is the goal, but because clarity is. When you experience the difference between environments that support clarity and those that disrupt it, the preference becomes obvious. Another important factor is predictability. In social environments, especially inconsistent ones, there's always an element of uncertainty. How will someone respond? What tone will the conversation take? What expectations are in place? That unpredictability requires constant adjustment, but in solitude, that adjustment disappears. There's no need to manage reactions or interpret signals. And without that constant processing, mental space opens up, focus improves, decision-making becomes more direct. Over time, this creates a new baseline. Solitude is no longer something to be filled. It's something that already has value. It becomes a place where energy is restored rather than spent, where clarity is maintained rather than disrupted. Now from the outside, this can look like withdrawal. Fewer interactions, less availability, reduced social presence. But that interpretation misses the underlying structure. It's not about avoiding people. It's about avoiding unnecessary complexity. Because once you become comfortable with your own environment, you're no longer driven to fill it with interactions that don't meet your standard. You don't seek connection just to avoid being alone. You allow connection when it aligns, and you step back when it doesn't. And this selectivity naturally reduces the number of connections over time. Not because connection isn't valued, but because it's no longer accepted at a lower level just for the sake of having it. So while others may see solitude as something to escape, it becomes something to maintain, not as isolation, but as a controlled space where clarity, stability, and consistency are already present, and anything added to it has to meet that same standard.